Hey,
Boom. Boom.
boom, there you are.
Calling Chris Anderson in London.
I am in London for just a short while more, and Rick Byers, you're still in
I'm
Chicago.
in Chicago. I feel like I'm glued to this seat.
Like I
I'm
said, you're
always
like the
here.
anchor. You're the magnet, man. You know.
Welcome everybody to History Happy Hour. Thanks to Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours for helping to bring you this show. Check out their rich offering of military history tours at stephenambrosetours.com. And you're headed out
I
on
am.
on a
Yeah.
tour, like what, Tuesday or something like that?
My flight to the States leaves at 8 o'clock Tuesday morning, which means I'll be getting to Heathrow about 5. So I'm really excited for
Nice.
that, yeah. And that's stage one in my trip out to the Pacific. So yeah.
Fantastic. Well, listen, everybody. I don't know if you're watching live or watching on replay or listening to the HHH podcast, but anyway, you're doing so. We're glad that you're here. Today, we're going to be talking about Christmas 1942 around the world. Let us know you're here and what you're drinking. Chris, I want to note that we are approaching, and you'll be gone when this happens, but we are approaching our 4th anniversary.
2 weeks, you said, just a few weeks.
Week or two from now. And I was looking at my Gmail today, and I looked at how many Gmail messages I had with the phrase History Happy Hour in them. And it was 5,958. And there's got to be almost as many others that are about History Happy Hour that don't have that phrase in it.
We need to get a life.
But before we get to life, we want to thank everybody who supports us on Patreon, especially our top shelf patrons. You can join this august and learned group. You see, I have remembered the phrase by clicking on patreon.com/history happy hour and pledging your lives and your sacred honor, or maybe it's just $10 a week or $20, whatever it is. Whatever it is. You can pledge any amount and we'll appreciate that.
And Rick will call you August.
And I will refer to you as august and learned. Can you tell us who any of the august and learned people are out there in the audience?
Yeah, well, Sue Meyer from Illinois has joined us. Doug McCord is back from Chester County, PA.
Nice.
Audrey Martins, the Martins are with us again, which is always great. Chris and Jean Templin. So they've come with us, and yeah.
They're not drinking. They're in St. Louis, but they're not drinking Anheuser-Busch.
Thank God for that.
Making it very clear.
You're a better person for it, too.
And Gwendolyn Rowe Grimes Simmons. Gwendolyn, you have many names, but thank you for joining us as well. And lots of other people. Thank you all for being here today. Chris, I think we've killed enough time. Should we get this show on the road?
Yes, I think we should.
Let's go.
The bar is open.
The bar is open, Chris. What is on tap?
Yeah. Today? So this week we are going to be joined by Dr. Peter Harmsen. And Dr. Harmsen studied at the National Taiwan University and has worked extensively in Asia, writing for Bloomberg, The Economist Intelligence Unit, and the Financial Times. His focus has been on Chinese-speaking societies, but he has written broadly on the Pacific in general, including Mongolia and North Korea. I may have this wrong because there are lots, but I counted the 9 books that he is the author of, all of which have been very well received, including New York Times bestseller Shanghai 1937, Stalingrad on the Yangtze. His books have been translated into Chinese, Danish, Romanian, but we're excited to have him here to talk about his new book, Darkest Christmas, December 1942 and a World at War. So welcome, Peter.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here. I know can't remember if you brought a cocktail with you or you were gonna just be drinking tea or what your situation was. But
I actually already had a lot of coffee, so I think I'll
Sit tight.
All right. Well, I'll toast that with a beer.
Oh,
And Chris, do you have something there? Or are you?
my Glentur at 12.
Yeah, you're gonna have to get a new bottle soon.
I guess I just did, actually.
All right. Well, Chris, start us off with Dr.
Thanks.
Harmsen.
All right.
And I hope it's okay if we call you Peter. So.
Okay.
That's absolutely fine. Yeah.
Okay.
Good. So, Peter, you begin the story of your book, and we're going to get into some of the details of it. But you begin the story of Christmas of 1942 by talking about the song "White Christmas," a song ironically written by a Russian Jew, Irving Berlin, who's neither American or Christian or celebrates Christmas, but he writes this song. It becomes famous by Bing Crosby, and you really talk movingly about how important this song is. So what is it about this song that is significant at that time, and why did you choose to kind of begin your book with that song?
Well, I picked the song to start off the book with for several reasons. One of the reasons was what you just mentioned, that it touched a lot of emotions with a lot of people throughout the world. This whole idea of Christmas being a time of the year which with the intensified emotions was something that really struck me as an interesting topic to look at in more closely. And another reason why I picked this song was because it reflects one of the main themes of my book, which is globalization. Of course, White Christmas is an American song, but as you mentioned, it's written by a Russian Jew that eventually became famous throughout the world, not just in English-speaking countries. So it kind of reflected this whole idea of war becoming a force of globalization. One of the sentences that I emphasize in my book is that war is globalization by other means, of course, suggesting this famous Clausewitz quote that war is politics by other means. I think you can say very much the same. War, and specifically World War, is globalization by other means.
Yeah.
It brings people together very often in violent ways, and it brings people to places that they would not otherwise have gone to. American farm boys who might never have visited the neighboring state were suddenly in completely different parts of the world, in the Southwest Pacific or on Iceland, eventually in Western Europe, in North Africa. So, and the same could be said about lots of other nationalities. Of course, Germans got to visit all of Europe in a rather specific way. So. And you can see, like, the world before World War II and the world after are completely different things. It was a much more globalized world, and a world where globalization was gradually accelerating in the decades after the war, because of forces like technological forces, cultural forces, even psychological forces that I think were set in motion by the war years.
Mm-hmm. I love the idea of war bringing people together. What they do when they're together, let's not talk about that, but we're bringing them together. Your book focuses on Christmas 1942. Maybe we can step back as a little bit of context and say, what is the status of the war at that point? And if you're going to write a book about one day in the war, which is something that I was looking at doing at one point, why did you pick this particular time?
Well, I picked December 1942 because I wanted to write like a global story of the war. And if I really wanted to write a story about the war as a world war, it had to be after 1941. Prior to December 1941, it wasn't really a global war. It was like two regional wars that only really merged together with America's entry into the war. But then again, like Christmas 1941 was a little bit too early. Like, the Americans had not really entered the war in a big way yet. So I decided to move it 1 year into the future, when America was engaged in on several different fronts across the globe, and you could really say that World War II had become like a globalized conflict, like a conflict over which the sun never set.
Okay. So I think also one of the other things I found interesting is we now in the 21st century, Christmas is a major holiday. It's a major holiday in 1942. But you have kind of some interesting things to say about sort of the importance of Christmas and how it, when it becomes significant, why it becomes significant. Because as you point out in the book, it's not even a federal holiday in America at the time of the Civil War, but by 1942, it's a recognizable event, I guess you would say. So what is it? How does Christmas become such a huge thing? And is it a big thing for everybody or just, Westerners, or how does this happen?
Well, that was one of the things that really struck me when I started looking into this, starting collecting source materials for my book. Of course, I knew it was a big thing in the English-speaking countries, in Scandinavia, of course in Germany. But what struck me was once I started looking into some of the other parts of the world, what was that the Christmas had already at that time become a big thing, even in a place like Japan, kind of like suggesting the kind of globalization that had taken place already in the early 20th century, especially in the 1920s when Japan had become a fairly liberalized society. It struck me that it was a big thing in Japan, mostly as a commercial thing, a commercial event in the big cities. But it was something that many Japanese, especially Japanese from the bigger cities, were familiar with, seeing Asian Santa Clauses outside the big department stores in Tokyo and Kyoto every December. So to them it was an event that they were familiar with, and they were also, to some extent, understanding of the fact that it meant a lot to the Westerners. And you even saw, rather surprisingly, some acts of kindness on the part of the Japanese personnel in some POW camps, probably a minority, but in a few there was like a temporary easing of conditions in a few Japanese-led POW camps.
But you mentioned that, and you mentioned that in one camp they brought in, a couple of camps, I guess, they brought in food. In one camp they brought in Red Cross packages that were then people were hoarding that food for the next 9 months or something. In another camp they brought in 30 ducks or something like that for people. This was quite surprising to me when I think about my vision of what Japanese run prison camps are like in World War II. But did that seem like it was an exception, like sort of amazing exceptions, or a suggestion that maybe that was more common than we perceive?
I haven't seen any general statistics, but my guess is that it was exceptions, and it shouldn't be, it shouldn't detract from the wider story of the horrific conditions in Japanese prison camps. And also it should be, of course, emphasized that this was just like a temporary thing. It was just a few days in December 1942. Some of the prisoners who noticed this slightly better treatment in December 1943 were hoping quietly that this was an indication of better conditions continuing into the future, but they were all disappointed. It was back to the same brutal treatment shortly after Christmas. And also, I haven't looked at it into any detail for Christmas 43 and 44, but I would imagine that later on in the war, when conditions became much more desperate for the Japanese, and then they, even the most optimistic among them, could see where it was heading, that conditions were far more brutal, even in Christmas time.
Can I follow up, Chris?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, no, I was going to say that there's a number of stories of, and we'll get into some of this, especially in Germany, regarding the Holocaust, involving, prisoners or people in camps. I mean, do you think you are reporting in the book, but asking you as someone who's looked at this, do you think that this treatment like this is essentially a little bit of Christmas time guilt over what's been going on, and a sense just that, like, maybe the littlest niggling sense that maybe we should have a little bit of conscience here?
Maybe in some of the German cases, I would have to say that I haven't. This would be speculation on my part.
Sure.
Especially when it comes to the Japanese. I haven't come across any sources of for example, Japanese camp commanders, what went through their heads, why they did what they did. So it's speculation. I think maybe less so for the Japanese, since Christmas was not a big thing and not a big part of their culture. Maybe more so in some of the German cases, where, of course, Christmas was an integral part of German culture. You could even say that was where Christmas as we know it started, way back in past centuries. Maybe there was like a nagging sense of guilt, but I haven't come across any sources that directly confirm this.
So Peter, one of the things that kind of is talked about quite a bit is that too much of history focuses on the West or the Western powers or whatnot. So you could say that, obviously to Christians or people from Christian countries, Christmas is a big deal, but we're talking about a world war. So we've got Muslims and Sikhs and Hindus and Confucians and all. How are they viewing this event, and how is this kind of day or its recognition impacting them? I mean, are they commenting on it, or are they, how do they fit into the story?
I haven't seen any sources where like non-Christian people directly comment on it, as like, look at this exotic Western holiday that's taking place like under our noses. So it's not something that I've really focused on in my book. I do try to describe, for example, in a non-Christian society such as the Soviet Union at the time, like how Christmas was kind of still celebrated in a small, almost discreet way, in a way that did not bother the regime too much. But the sources of this are fairly limited.
Yeah, I just it's interesting to me because it comes up in the book that Christmas has become significant enough that even if you're not Christian, you're aware that there's this big holiday and lots of people are celebrating,
my book is kind of like a cultural history of World War II and a history of like how the culture, world culture, global culture as we know today is to some extent and to, I would say, a significant extent a product of World War II. One of the major aspects of this being the way that Christmas and especially the American way of celebrating Christmas was spread to different parts of the world. One of the most significant examples, I think, is how American soldiers, servicemen stationed in the British Isles, interacted with the local population and kind of like exchanged Christmas traditions, which I think was maybe to some extent like a one-way road. It was like Americans showing the Brits how Christmas is celebrated across the Atlantic. As kind of like
here's how we do it. We don't really care how you do it. Right?
Yeah. Well, there was a bit of like also cultural curiosity on the American side. American GIs paying noticing like, oh, this is how we do it in Britain. That's interesting. But I still think it was a kind of like a one-directional movement towards American Christmas being projected to different parts of the world. Of course, it was a development that only was starting up during the war and continued after in the decades after the war.
Yeah.
So your book basically rolls around the globe. You start with kind of in the Hawaii, and you move all the way around the globe and come back to America, sort of following the clock, essentially. And it strikes me as the kind of book that would be very challenging to research, because you can't go to a single archive and say, well, I'm going to go to the National Archives, or I'm going to go to the archives in Britain at Kew, and I'm going to find one place and I'm going to find all the stuff right there. So how did you go about gathering material for this book?
Before I answer that question, maybe can I just mention something about this whole concept of like going around the world, like follow the
Absolutely,
crowd?
Sure.
Yeah, my book is published in 3 different versions. Like this is like the you would say the international version, the British American version. That's the one you referred to, where
I got one too.
Yeah. Okay. You begin the trip at the international date line in the mid-Pacific,
Right.
and then move around.
Not Hawaii. Yeah.
Then we've got the kind of like the Australian New Zealand version, which has the same chapters pretty much, but in a different order, where you begin with Australia and New Zealand, and where the chapter on Australia and New Zealand is kind of expanded compared with the international version, where you do the same trip around the world, but like begin a little bit further to the west. And then finally there's the Danish version, where the first chapter is about Denmark, and then you do the tour around the world. Pretty much the same chapters, but just in a new
20
order.
more versions that are all organized differently.
That was kind of my ulterior motive, so I'm still waiting. but to return to your question of like how I found the various sources, in a way, it was hard to find sources because you have to like look in so many different places. On the other hand, it was not so hard. One of the reasons why I decided to write about Christmas, basically I just wanted to write a story about one day in the war. But one reason why I picked Christmas is because everyone probably has some kind of recollection about what they did on December 24th, 25th, 1942. People who participated in the war. Like otherwise, probably recollections became rather hazy over the years. So like one day merged into the other, and no one would be able to say what did you do on May 27th, 1943. But I think most people would remember, where were you during Christmas 1942. So that was also reflected in a lot of the material I looked at, like especially memoirs from the war. So that made it a little bit easier for me to find material that I could use. But still, it was a lot of work to find the information I needed, and it took several years for me to complete the job. Actually, I began work on this book back in 2017 at the 75th anniversary of Christmas 1942, when I wrote an article for a newspaper about this subject, and realized that there was much more material there than just for one newspaper article. There was enough for one book. So I spent the following 4 to 5 years gathering information in different sources, also while working on other books. So it was just like something, when I found someone remembering something that happened during Christmas 1942, I just put it aside for later use.
So Peter, obviously there's a natural inclination, I think, to talk about peace on earth and goodwill towards men towards Christmas. But obviously in your book, as you point out, there's a whole lot of ugliness going on too. And I don't want the conversation to be just about the holiday, but to talk about the war in general. So without, giving away all the secrets of the book and given the time restrictions, but can you talk a little bit about some of the combat that's going on? There's some very serious battles going on around the world on this day.
Yeah. That was another reason why I picked December 1942 instead of like December 1941. That it was like really, or December 1943 for that matter. December 1942 was a time when things were really hanging in the balance, especially if you were living through that time. Of course, with the benefit of hindsight, as a historian today, you can probably pretty much like reach a conclusion that the war had been won for the Allies significantly before December 1942. But when you were standing right in the middle of things back in December 1942, it was not quite so obvious. Of course, you had the Germans in Stalingrad, but they had not lost yet. It was still there was still some slender hopes among the Germans surrounded in Stalingrad that maybe the Führer would come and help them. Of course, that was unrealistic by that time, but people still, the common German foot soldiers still cherish those hopes. The same thing in the Pacific. You could say that the Pacific had pretty much the war in the Pacific had pretty much been decided on December 7th, 1941. The moment the first Japanese shot was fired, that's when they lost the war. But that was not obvious at the time. The Americans and the British, the Americans in the Southwest, Americans and Australians in the Southwest Pacific had only just started going on the offensive in a small way. So we're still like very much hanging in the balance, which was what kind of attracted me to the subject and to this particular time in history, that people at the time didn't really know where this was all heading. Of course, they were hoping. There were hopes on both sides, but no one could tell for sure at the time.
You have a quote from a German soldier about the precautions they took against the Russians on Christmas Eve. He says, "It was the most wonderful night of the year, but also one of the nights the soldiers feared most." His name was Harry Meilert. And we all know the story of the Christmas truce in 1914. Was Christmas in 1942 the opposite, with troops launching bloody attacks to try to take their enemy by surprise on Christmas?
Well, it was a little bit of both, depending on where you were. If you were on the Eastern Front, there were several examples of the Russians picking Christmas to launch offensives against the Germans and their allies, knowing that this would be a time where maybe they would have their guards down a little bit less than in usual times, and maybe also as a form of like psychological warfare, hitting them at a time when they were maybe like more sentimental than usual, and where their thoughts were elsewhere. So yeah, definitely no truce on the Eastern Front. A bit of a truce in North Africa, where the Allied had just landed a few weeks before. There's some evidence of German and Allied troops sitting in their trenches and suddenly like starting to sing Christmas songs in their respective languages, but without emerging from the trenches and like shaking hands. It wasn't anything like that. I think to some extent this also shows that World War II, maybe a little bit contrary to popular ideas about the conflict, that World War II was in many ways a more brutal conflict than World War I. You had these hatreds, national and even ideological hatreds that had been allowed to develop for several decades at the time, which you didn't have in 1914, and I think made something like the Christmas truce in 1914 more easy to achieve.
So I was going to ask you about the Christmas truce, and you touched on that, and perhaps why those things are different. One of the areas that I'd like to dive into, because I just found it really fascinating, was this idea of Christmas in Germany in 1942.
Yeah.
Boy, for me, the part of your book that really I found the most compelling was this, because the dissonance
disturbing,
going on here is really, really amazing. In terms of Christmas, how are the Germans viewing this? And we'll kind of use that as a point. They've got God is with us on their belt buckles. They are, as you touch on, kind of the originators of Christmas, if you want to say. They believe in the holiday, but they're fighting for the victory of one of the most abhorrent regimes in human history. So could maybe start touching on that odd dichotomy a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I think to the Germans at the time, at least to the vast majority of them, there wasn't really any contradiction. I mean, they saw themselves as the defenders of German and to some extent even European civilization against the Red Hordes to the east. To at least to some Germans, celebrating or passing Christmas either at home or in the front line was a reminder of kind of this like civilizational mission that they saw themselves on, defending Europe against communism. So I think at least to the vast majority of Germans, there might not have been such a huge discrepancy. Of course, to Germans who saw themselves in opposition to the regime, it was different. They remarked on this on this contradiction or this this irony in sometimes in secret diaries.
Yeah, well, Rick, I just want to kind of
Go ahead.
Like,
I've got some follow-ups on this too.
Yeah, I mean, you have a group of people who, as you were saying, identify this as an example of their civilization, but by the same token, you have the leaders of the Nazi Party. You talk about Goebbels to some great length, basically saying that Christmas is an example of how better we are than everybody else. But oh, by the way, we're going to invent our own Christmas holiday because we don't want to have a Christian Christmas holiday. Did you? I mean, I guess that's not a question, but as you're pouring through all this, how are you kind of filtering this? Because
or what struck you most strongly about this? Chris used the word dissonance. I use the word paradox. This German kind of attitude versus reality.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that struck me the most was conditions in the Dutch internment camp Westerbork, where they celebrated Christmas, like the leading Nazis, the SS who were in charge of the camp, invited the best buddies from the German occupation army to come and celebrate Christmas at Westerbork camp. At the time, they were eating food. It was like a transit camp for Dutch Jews before they were sent east for annihilation. This big Christmas party that the Germans held for themselves was basically staffed by people who were going to be killed a few weeks into the future. It was like Jewish chefs, Jewish waiters, a Jewish orchestra playing for the Germans. What struck me was how this event and also conditions in Westerbork camp more generally highlighted this odd mixture of daily routines and the biggest crime in the history of mankind. A little bit similar to I don't know if you watched this recent movie, A Zone of Interest, about the camp commander at Auschwitz. How everyday routines and everyday life that we can like immediately recognize coexisted with being responsible for probably the biggest crime in human history.
Yeah.
That's our one reference to the Academy Awards during this show. I want to stay on this topic a little bit, but I want to remind people first that we are speaking with Peter Harmsen, who is the author of the book Darkest Christmas, December 1942, and A World at War. And there's so many aspects of this that I made notes about, but you talked about Joseph Goebbels. And you kind of held him up as an example of the a little bit of an example of the lies that Germans were telling themselves this Christmas. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, Goebbels is a wonderful source, of course, wonderful in terms of being a source with of whom there's a lot of material. He was a copious diary writer, and in addition to running like this huge propaganda machine, spent probably several hours a day writing about every detail of his routines and every detail of what he was thinking, including in the days prior to and during Christmas 1942, where on the one hand he was like one of the main culprits in this like vast murderous machine that was the Third Reich. On the other hand, he was like a family man, caring about his children who were waiting at home for daddy, hoping that he would be there at least for a few minutes on Christmas Eve to celebrate Christmas with them. So that was, I think it kind of like it gives you maybe the essential of or the essence of the contradiction that you saw in many Germans. On the one hand, celebrating Christmas as always, at the same time as they were participating in this murderous regime.
And of course, the great family man agonizing about not being able to spend time with his family, who he eventually will all murder.
Yeah.
Nice.
Well, and you have, again, we're talking about it now, but I mean, with the chapter where a lot of this comes out in your book is called "We're Turning into Wolves." Where does that come from? What was the I don't want to say inspiration. That sounds too uplifting for this particular chapter. But why we're turning into wolves? Where does that come? Because there are other examples that you get.
Yeah, well, it's a chapter about Eastern Europe, which was really the dark heart of Europe and maybe the dark heart of the world in 1942, where all the worst influences were coming together to create hell on earth. It's from a passage in the book about a Jewish resistance fighter who is stumbling through the streets of Krakow in the evening of December 24th, having just been shot in the leg by the German Gestapo, walking through the streets of Krakow, trying to look normal, even though he can feel that the warm blood is like streaming down his leg, and knowing that he will probably bleed to death unless he gets some kind of help. Decides to walk into a Catholic church in the hope of maybe getting some help there. You would imagine that on Christmas Eve, if you get help somewhere, that would be in a church, but actually where he gets kicked out. Maybe not because the priest is evil, but because the priest is scared. So yeah, to me it shows that war turns people into wolves, not so much because they may necessarily are bad people, but because they're forced by circumstances and forced by something as fundamental as fear.
So we're in a dark part of the show, and it's going to get a little darker. You write about the contrast of Christmas and the Holocaust, and you have a quote from Victor Gollancz, who's a British publisher and humanitarian, who's writing a pamphlet this Christmas time, which he's going to publish in 1943, called "Let My People Go." And he writes about a statement by Anthony Eden, who's the Foreign Secretary of Great Britain, promising retribution to the Germans committing the crimes against the Jews. And he writes, "Will the death of these reduce by one jot or tittle the agony of a Jewish child, who at this very moment I write, on Christmas Day, 3 hours after the sweet childish carol, 'O Come All Ye Faithful,' was broadcast on the 7 o'clock news, is going to her death in a sealed coach, her lungs poisoned with the unslaked lime with which the floor is strewn, and with the dead standing upright about her, because there is no room for them all." And what struck me really hard about this passage was the degree to which some people in the Allied world really understood exactly what was going on in Germany years before the end of the war and long before anything is really being done about it. And it really is I found that quote to be just a really searing indictment of how little was done.
Yeah. I think the problem was there was one of the problems was there was so much propaganda in circulation, and people probably knew that they were being exposed to propaganda, and lots of people, members of the public in the West, when they read these pamphlets and these very accurate descriptions of the Holocaust, may simply have thought that this was like propaganda. It was probably exaggerated a little bit. That's my assumption, that was part of the reason that nothing more was done.
So in this dark place, and we have been talking about some very dark things, and obviously there's a lot of combat, and you talk about that all over the world. What are, say, Roosevelt? You talk about Eleanor Roosevelt. What are people or Allied leaders doing to sustain morale, to keep people in the fight? Because I would imagine it's really hard to get into the Christmas spirit in 1942. You will kind of expand on this a little bit, but we talk about the King's Speech, for example. What are the leaders saying to people, like, how can we use Christmas to kind of get through this?
Well, to use the King's Speech as an example, it seems to me that he is trying to talk to his people, as to some extent his peers, explain to them that this is a hard time that all of us are going through. Not trying to paint a too rosy picture, because that would be ridiculous. Everyone knew that it was a hard time, and there were probably years of war awaiting in the future. But at the same time, reflecting that this was a hard time for everyone, including for himself. Like he was unable to see his family as much as he wanted, just as his subjects were unable to see their families. Trying to build a bond between rulers and ruled, about this situation as something that we are in this together, and we have to get through this together.
So we have following up on that, I want to bring up a question from somebody in our audience who says, what was the mood of Americans in Christmas 1942? The Allies were struggling in the Atlantic, and the Pacific was just beginning to turn after Midway. And I know you write a lot about what's going on New Guinea and such places, but what is the situation for Americans at this point in the war?
I think it's probably it's hard for me to generalize about such a huge population.
Well, maybe shoot us a couple of examples from the book of what's going on with American soldiers at this time.
Yeah. Well, it was in a way it was the first war Christmas for the Americans. Of course, December 1941 was actually the actual first war Christmas, but many Americans had not even been drafted in late December 1941. America had only really become a society at war a year later, during December 1942. And I think if I was to like maybe generalize a little bit, after all, I think maybe the general sentiment that united many Americans was this sense of longing for relatives far away, maybe in distant battlefields, or even if we look at first and second generation Japanese immigrants in internment camps in the Western United States, longing for friends and relatives outside of the internment camps. So yeah, I would say like the general mood was one of longing, which was also, I think, one of the reasons why White Christmas was becoming such a huge success, because it kind of expressed this longing in very eloquent terms.
Well, one of the things, you kind of don't want to just spend all of our time talking about Germany, but again, there are just so many moments of the book where you just shake your head and try to get your head around it. But one of the other areas, again, it surprised me that phrases, words, speeches that we now look upon as being significant have some connection to this Christmas. Another one you talk about in the book was Arthur Harris, who's head of the British strategic bombing campaign, and he's been given his orders by Churchill, and basically his mandate is to burn Germany to the ground. And he gives a famous speech called the Reap the Whirlwind speech, but it's done with the backdrop of Christmas. So I find it very ironic that in talking about, the higher ideals of Christmas, that's going to be the platform to really ratchet up the violence.
Yeah.
When people like Harris are giving these speeches, what's the reaction amongst British civilians? Are they saying, "Wait a minute, this is too much"? Or are they behind this? How are the British people or the Allies adjusting to these sorts of calls?
Well, again, of course, it's hard to really generalize, but I think British people who only had like the Battle of Britain and the Blitz only a couple of years in the past, so in fresh recollection, and we're still like suffering from the attacks of the Luftwaffe occasionally. I think there was probably I can't imagine there was too much pity for the Germans now getting to taste a little bit of their own medicine. Of course, people become a little bit become very dehumanized in times of war and accept acts of violence on a massive scale that they would, of course, shrink back from in times of peace. And I haven't seen any in my research. I haven't come across any sources where Americans or Brits at the grassroots start questioning, like, what are we doing here? Like during Christian Christmas, actually ratcheting up the violence.
Yeah.
So I'm sure when you set out to write this book, you had some stories packed away that you knew you could use, and I know you started 7 years ago. But what did you discover in the course of your research that really surprised you, that you said, "Oh, wow, I'm glad I've done this because this is something I didn't know, and I really want to get this in the book"?
Well, there were some details that interested me or that struck me. For example, the fact that this German radio broadcast where they called different parts of the around the periphery of the German Empire, like all the way from northern Norway, Finland, down to southern France. That this was not, as claimed by some historians, it was not completely fictitious. There have been some claims that this was actually like actors standing in a radio studio in Berlin, just pretending to be soldiers in the front line, like calling in. This was actually real soldiers communicating with Berlin via radio. The reason I know is because of two documents that emerged in the course of my research. One being the actual script of this radio broadcast, showing like how this was based on actual recordings of soldiers from around the occupied territories. The other one was the war diary of the German Naval Command, showing that two U-boats were actually taken out of service for a couple of days in December 1942, so they could take part in this broadcast. So of course it was fictional. They wouldn't need these U-boats. They could be used for something much more useful. So yeah, that struck me.
So Peter, I mean, just so our audience knows a little bit more about this, and when they buy your book and read it, they'll find out a lot more about it. But what is the name of this show? Because it's a big deal in Germany. And what are we talking about? Because it's very interesting how the Germans using Christmas as a propaganda tool. But what is the name of the show? What are they actually trying to do? And how important is this in Germany?
Yeah, it was called the Ringsendung. So yeah, like a broadcast anchored by Berlin, where they called different parts of the German Reich and the occupied territories, talking to ordinary soldiers. It was like a 90-minute broadcast that was broadcast to pretty much the entire German population. So kind of like showcasing both the military might of the German Reich, but also its technological prowess, its ability to tie the home front and the war front together by means of what was pretty sophisticated communications technology at the time.
Mhm.
So yeah, it was an annual event that took place the first time in 1940 and then continued throughout the war. Not all of these broadcasts have survived. For example, the one from 1942, only the last few minutes have survived. The one from 1940 has survived in its entirety.
And one of the things you write about when you write about this time period in Germany, which again is just a fascinating part of the story, is that there is a very conscious effort by the leadership, by Goering and by Goebbels and by other people to keep morale up in Germany, to do whatever they can, right?
Yeah.
To keep morale up, because they look at the example from World War I and where they thought they were betrayed by the home front, and they don't want that to happen.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that I wouldn't say it was something that surprised me because I read about it elsewhere, but it's kind of like striking, like to the extent that the German population was actually pampered by the leadership during most of the war, exactly because of this experience or this analysis of events in 1918, whether they were true or not, that Germany lost mainly because the morale at home collapsed. That, of course, can be debated, but that was like the interpretation of history that motivated the Nazis 25 years later to make sure that this did not happen again. Which is why the Germans were not asked to shoulder burdens because of the war, unless it was absolutely necessary, and unless it couldn't, like the burden could not be pushed onto some of the occupied people. And you had to get into like 1940, 1945 to 1944, 1945 to really see the German government giving up this idea of trying to build morale or
well, you
keep
talk
morale up.
you talk about the fact that they basically starting in August, Goering sends people out to the rest of the occupied nations in Europe to strip away anything they've got.
Yeah,
bring
yeah,
it
he
to
liked to plan it.
Germany.
Yeah, he was. He liked to plan in advance. Yeah, he was. He was a long-term Christmas shopper, you could say.
Well, he's certainly big enough to be Santa.
Yeah, very few of us start planning for Christmas that early, but he did. Yeah, in August, he assembled all the bigwigs, instructing them to buy up or steal everything that could be of value, anything of some maybe a luxury significance that could be used as Christmas presents to be shipped back to Germany and be used as Christmas presents for the German people.
Yeah. So Peter, there's again, if you read the book, when you read the book, you'll have a lot of these moments too. But as I read your book, there were lots of times I had to kind of stop and try to digest everything that was going on. But one of the things that struck me, and I would just like to get your thoughts on it, given this experience for all these people, given the universality of things like White Christmas, how much of Christmas as we know it today, celebrate it today, look at it today, is a byproduct of the war and the experience of the war? Did the war change how people look at this holiday?
I think it mainly changed how we look at Christmas in terms of making it an American holiday, or making the American way of celebrating Christmas the global way of celebrating it. It's probably something that would have happened anyway, but it would have happened much slower if World War II had not arrived. Again, this is to me, this is what makes my book to some extent like a cultural history of World War II and a cultural history of the post-war world, showing like how this Americanization of the world had deep roots in World War II, and probably would have happened anyway, but happened at a much accelerated pace because of the way the war ended.
Last question for you. Your title of your book is The Darkest Christmas. And so when you were done with the book, were you overwhelmed by the grief and misery, or were you buoyed up by the positive stories? Where did you come out, plus or minus on that?
Probably speaking net, probably more plus than minus, because I knew, of course, that World War II was a terrible thing. And yeah, I was surprised at the many ways that people managed to find hope and even show kindness to each other, and sometimes even to enemies, even at a time when war otherwise brought the worst out in people.
Well, Peter Harmsen, thank you so much for joining us today to chat about your book, which is called Darkest Christmas, December 1942 and a World at War. Lots of interesting stuff in there if you decide to take a look at it. And thank you so much for coming on the show and taking our many questions today.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Enjoyed it very much.
All right. Thank you. Yeah. So, Chris, next week you're jetting off to the Pacific.
I am.
I mean, Boston and then the Pacific. Boston's not in the Pacific, just to clarify for everybody who are geographically challenged. So we'll be presenting an encore episode, and we are presenting one of our most popular episodes of all time, which is
about the Ghost Army.
About all right, you're in trouble now. Which is about Bass Reeves, who was the first black deputy U.S. Marshal west of the Mississippi River. He was quite a badass, supposedly killed 14 outlaws, and managed to survive as a lawman in the Old West. He's the subject of a fairly recent TV series on Paramount, and we'll present our conversation with Art Burton, who is the author of Black Gun, Silver Star, The Life and Legend of Frontier Marshal Bass Reeves. So if you have, I don't know, I'm going crazy. If you haven't had a chance to take a look at that show, this is a great opportunity to sort of see what that's all about and why it's our most popular episode.
Well, and also,
aside from the Ghost Army.
Well, yeah. But also you'll get to see, holograms of Rick and Chris as we move through time and space.
Yes, so we are going to be pretending to be in the studio, trying to fool you. See how good a job we don't do. All right. So please subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us on Facebook, shout at us on Twitter, listen to our podcast, back us on patreon.com, and browse our website at historyhappyhour.com.
Thanks, everybody. Be safe.